always think about, like getting a virus,
Right.
writing it out,
Right.
and then like that's it, you're done.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah.
But like what if some viruses like leave a much longer like impact? You know
Wow.
what I mean?
Yeah.
Today we're doing a deep dive into some of the really surprising long-term complications from measles
Right.
and looking at some recent info that really highlights some dangers that go way beyond just the initial, rash and fever.
Exactly. I think most people, when they think about measles, they just think, oh, yeah, another one of those childhood diseases that's unpleasant.
Right.
But, you get it and you get over it.
Yeah.
But what we want to explore today is why measles is uniquely concerning
Okay.
and really unpack what the long-term effects could be.
Okay, so let's talk about like the first thing that comes to mind when you hear measles,
Yeah.
which is the measles rash.
Of course.
But this is not just about a rash.
Yeah.
The stuff that we're looking at even points to a recent outbreak in West Texas
Right.
that sadly led to hospitalizations and even deaths.
Yeah.
And that alone tells you that this is a serious illness, even in the short term.
It is, and I think what's really striking is the longer impact that
Yeah.
it can have on your immune system.
Okay.
And this is where this idea of immune amnesia comes in,
Okay.
which is really kind of remarkable.
Immune amnesia. That
Yeah.
sounds pretty serious.
It is.
Can you break down for us like what that actually means?
So think about it this way. The measles virus can essentially erase your body's memory
Wow.
of past infections.
Hmm.
It targets and destroys the very cells.
Okay.
And to remember all the illnesses that you've had or the vaccines you've gotten.
Okay.
These are things like plasma cells and memory T and B cells.
Right.
And they're like the librarians of your immune system,
Okay.
holding the records of every past encounter you've had with a pathogen.
Gotcha.
Measles comes in and burns the library down.
Wow, that's a pretty vivid image. So
Yeah.
if these librarians are gone, like what's the real world consequence for
Right.
someone who's had measles?
It means your body can forget how to fight off infections that it's seen before.
Wow.
So, for example, if you had chickenpox as a child
Right.
and you developed immunity,
Yeah.
measles can actually wipe out those memory cells
Wow.
and make you susceptible to getting chickenpox again.
Oh,
And we're talking about a period that can last for months.
oh gosh.
And some research even suggests it could be for a couple of years.
That is astonishing.
Yeah.
I would not have thought that a virus could have such a long-reaching effect on your established immunity.
Yeah.
Is there like actual data that shows how significant this memory loss is?
There is a study in 2019
Okay.
that showed some really compelling numbers.
Okay.
And what they found was that a measles infection can reduce your existing antibody levels by anywhere from 11% to 73%.
Wow, that's a huge range.
Yeah,
So someone could lose a substantial part of their immunity.
they could.
Does the research say anything about why there might be such a big difference?
It didn't really pinpoint any exact reasons for that variability,
Okay.
but it really underscores that there is significant damage
Right.
that can occur to the immune system
Yeah.
as a result of measles
Right.
and how well it's able to remember those past infections.
Right.
And I think immunologist Akiko Iwasaki really put it well when she said, that's why it's called amnesia.
Right.
We forget who the enemies are.
Yeah.
So it really highlights how fundamentally
Right.
measles can disrupt our immunity.
So how does measles actually accomplish this immune amnesia? Like,
Yeah.
how does it specifically target these memory cells?
So measles actually infects and destroys immune cells.
Okay.
And this includes those really critical memory cells.
Okay.
It's not just that the immune system is sort of temporarily weakened
Right.
as a side effect.
Gotcha.
The virus actually has a specific way of going after these cells.
So the information that we have mentions this Trojan horse analogy. Can you
Yeah.
explain a little bit about how that fits in?
Yeah, so Akiko Iwasaki describes how measles is able to actually gain entry into some immune cells called macrophages.
Oh, okay.
And macrophages are kind of like the surveillance unit of your immune system.
Gotcha.
Measles can actually hijack these macrophages and use them as a Trojan horse
Wow.
to spread throughout the immune system
Okay.
and infect other cells, including those memory cells
Gotcha.
that are located in the lymph nodes.
So it's not like the memory cells are just caught in the crossfire.
Right,
They're a direct target of
Yeah.
this Trojan horse strategy.
exactly.
And that really, I guess, emphasizes how measles is different from a lot of other viruses.
It does, because a lot of viruses can suppress the immune system,
Right.
but measles really goes right after the immune memory.
Okay.
And that's why you have this prolonged period of vulnerability after infection.
So that would make sense then that you would have this increased vulnerability to other infections.
Exactly.
Because if your immune system has basically forgotten these past threats, you'd expect to be more susceptible to getting sick again with things you've already encountered.
That's the direct result of immune amnesia.
Right.
So because your body's lost some of its memory of how to combat these previously encountered pathogens,
Right.
people who've had measles can be more vulnerable to a range of other infections.
Yes,
And this could be bacterial infections like pneumonia.
Right.
It could be other viral infections.
Okay.
It can even be things like diarrheal diseases
Wow.
and meningitis.
Okay.
So it's a pretty wide range.
Yeah, the information that we have has a quote from Dr. Adam Ratner, who is a pediatrician,
Ah,
and he was talking about how children are constantly exposed to so many different microbes.
right.
How does measles complicate that?
So what Dr. Ratner was talking about was the fact that, young children are constantly being introduced to new germs.
Right.
Their immune systems are always learning and
Yeah.
building up these defenses.
Yeah.
And measles can come in and essentially erase
Oh.
some of that hard-earned immunity, making them susceptible to common childhood illnesses
Right.
that they may have otherwise fought off easily.
Right.
So it's almost like their immune systems have to go back
Right.
and relearn
Right.
lessons that they had already mastered.
Yeah, and that's a surprisingly long window of vulnerability.
Yeah.
Like when you think about, as we move through different seasons and we're exposed to different illnesses and things.
Absolutely.
So it's not just a theoretical weakening of
Yeah.
the immune system.
Right.
It has like tangible real world consequences in terms of like an increased risk of other illnesses.
Exactly. And this period of heightened susceptibility can be a real concern,
Yeah.
especially in younger children
Right.
whose immune systems are still developing.
Now, the information also talks about some very serious long-term neurological complications.
Yes.
And I think this is something that people are even less aware of
Uh-huh.
than this immune amnesia.
Right.
And while these complications are thankfully rare, there's this devastating long-term complication called subacute sclerosing panencephalitis, or SSPE.
Right.
And this is a progressive disease of the brain
Yeah.
that can emerge years.
Right.
Typically within 10 years, but in some instances much later
Wow.
after a measles infection.
Yeah, that's one of the really unsettling things.
Years later,
Yeah.
that sounds incredibly frightening.
It
It's like,
really-
what causes SSPE?
It's caused by a persistent measles virus infection in the brain.
Okay.
So while the exact mechanisms aren't completely understood,
Right.
the virus can somehow remain dormant in the brain
Wow.
for this extended period of time
Okay.
and then reactivate
Right.
and trigger this progressive and ultimately fatal condition.
So do we know if like the severity of the initial measles infection
Yeah.
is like a predictor of who might develop SSPE?
It doesn't seem to be a direct predictor.
Okay.
Like how severe your initial infection was
Yeah.
doesn't necessarily correlate with whether or not you'll develop SSPE later on.
Oh, wow. So are there any like telltale signs of SSPE? Like
Yeah.
how does this disease actually progress?
So Dr. Bessie G. Varghese,
Okay.
who specializes in pediatric infectious diseases,
Right.
she describes the typical progression.
Okay.
And it often begins with kind of subtle changes in personality and behavior.
Okay.
And those can be very easily overlooked initially.
Right.
And then over time, it progresses to include things like seizures and involuntary movements.
Wow.
And eventually, it actually starts to impact really essential bodily functions
Okay.
like breathing and heart rate.
Wow.
And tragically, it usually leads to death
Oh my God.
within 1 to 3 years after diagnosis,
Wow.
although some individuals can survive longer.
So is there any way to identify who might be at higher risk of developing SSPE?
Unfortunately, there's no real definitive way to predict
Okay.
who will develop SSPE.
Right.
It remains a rare complication.
Okay.
But research does suggest,
Okay.
and this includes a review of cases in California, that there's a higher estimated rate of SSPE
Okay.
in children who are unvaccinated
Okay.
and contracted measles before the age of 1.
So even though it's rare,
Uh-huh.
the potential consequences are so devastating that it's still a significant concern.
Exactly. The really devastating nature of SSPE, even with its rarity, really underscores how serious
Right.
the potential for long-term harm from measles is.
Yeah.
And that it really does go far beyond just those initial symptoms.
This is all quite sobering.
Yeah.
It really drives home the point that measles is so much more
Mm.
than just a childhood rash.
Right.
So in light of all this, like, what can be done to protect against these serious
Well,
complications?
the information's very clear
Okay.
that the best defense against these complications,
Okay.
including both that immune amnesia that we talked about
Right.
and the really tragic SSPE,
Right.
is the measles vaccine.
Okay.
And the measles vaccine has a very high effectiveness rate at
Okay.
about 97% after 2 doses.
97% is a very strong level of protection.
Yeah.
So getting vaccinated not only reduces your risk of getting sick with measles in the first place,
Mm-hmm.
but it also shields you from these potentially devastating long-term consequences.
Right.
So it's really a way to prevent not only the initial illness,
Yeah.
but also these really devastating long-term effects.
Exactly. Vaccination is the best tool we have
Right.
to prevent not just the initial measles,
Right.
but also these long-term effects.
And I think for, someone like you who appreciates getting to the core of
Yeah.
the matter quickly and thoroughly,
Right.
understanding, the protective power of the vaccine against these hidden dangers is key.
It is.
Yeah, it really reframes it.
It does.
It's not just about avoiding a few days of fever and a rash.
Right.
It's about protecting against these much more serious and lasting impacts on our health.
Exactly. It shifts the focus from simply the acute illness
Right.
to the potential for, really significant and lifelong consequences.
Well, this has been a really insightful
Yeah.
and frankly quite eye-opening
Mm-hmm.
deep dive into measles.
It really is.
So just to quickly summarize,
Hmm.
measles is not just a rash.
Right.
It has this unique ability to cause immune amnesia
Right.
by actively targeting and depleting our immune memory,
Uh-huh.
which then leaves us more vulnerable to other infections for quite a while.
Yes.
And in some very rare but devastating cases,
Ta-
can lead to that fatal neurological condition, SSPE, years later.
Wow.
And I think the biggest takeaway here is that the measles vaccine is a highly effective
Yeah.
and safe way
Wow.
to protect ourselves and our communities from these very real dangers.
Absolutely.
So I think, as we wrap up this deep dive into the complexities of measles,
Yeah.
it really makes you think,
It does.
considering the potential for these really long-term impacts on
Oh.
the immune system
Yeah.
that stretch way beyond the initial illness.
Yeah.
How might our understanding of infectious diseases need to evolve? Yeah.
To really account for these more subtle
Right.
and delayed consequences.
Yeah.
And for you, as you've been listening to this,
Uh-huh.
what further questions does this exploration into these ways that viruses can impact our immunity
Yeah.
raise about other infectious agents
Yeah.
that we encounter in our lives?
Yeah,
Definitely something to ponder.
absolutely.
Thanks for listening.
Of course.
We'll see you next time.